Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be here. I started this study about a year after the birth of my child. And one of the first things that I did was to come to this conference in 2014. So I feel like I've come a bit of a full circle. I met some of you for the first time then, and certainly just was exposed to the warmth and generosity of this community, for which I'm profoundly grateful. But nobody that I spoke to is responsible for anything I'm saying. I'll take that on myself. I really want to honor all the care and the warmth that I always found when I was speaking to moms and to birth workers about how they think about risk. And everyone is passionate about trying to make birth safe. Some of the things I say you may find a little provocative. I do consider it my job as an intellectual to provoke. So hopefully this can be one part of a bigger conversation and a way of thinking about things which you'll get from everyone else and also just think of on your own. So it started for me thinking about private birth. Was when one of the moms that I was working with, Ellen, wanted her birth to be so private that she didn't want me to be there, which was quite a big thing if you're an anthropologist, because, hang on, you just, no. All right, because that's your whole job, is to observe what people are doing. That's the way that you do research. So if someone says you can't observe, then it's a bit of wind out of your sails. But I really understood what she was getting at, because in the first place I remembered my own labor, where most of all I wanted everyone to leave me alone. And in the second place, by the time I'd met Ellen, I trained as a doula, and I knew that it matters who is present at a birth, and it matters how many people are present at a birth. And I also understood that in Ellen's case, she still felt traumatized by her first baby's C-section delivery, a surgery she hadn't wanted, and that she felt she had been subtly or not so subtly coerced into. After only 7 hours of labor in a private hospital in Cape Town, her doctor had said she wasn't dilating at a rate of 1 centimeter per hour, which she felt was inaccurate because the doctor's vaginal examination had shown it was 2 centimeters less than the midwife's one, which had just happened at the same, just before the doctor. But the doctor was persistent, and eventually she gave in, which she regretted because she had really very bad postnatal depression after the C-section. So for the second birth, she was determined not to fall into this trap again, and she didn't want to have performance anxiety by having lots of observers. She wanted a private birth, and she got one. She safely birthed her second child vaginally without the use of vacuum suction at home. Had she been in a hospital, because her labor was quite long and because it sort of stopped and started, it's 99% sure that she would have had another C-section, whether she was in a private or a public hospital. And even if she had been with another home birth practice, it was possible that she might have had another C-section. So what is a private birth? It's a term I'm making up to describe what I found in my fieldwork. And yes, a home setting does help for having a private birth, but not just because it allows for more physical privacy from strangers, but because it allows for more control, sometimes, and sometimes not. I think we know that independent midwives are being more and more constrained by having to keep to protocols that are defined in the hospital sector. So it's simply not always possible to have that space and that authority maybe where you most expect it. So private birth, the way I'm thinking about it, the way it came out of my fieldwork, was it's got to do with a mother's control over who is present, a mother's control over forms of monitoring, and a mother's control over the duration of labor. Facilitating private birth, as I observed it in Cape Town, is in some ways it's simple, but it takes quite a lot of preparation. So I want to run through that quickly so that you have that sense of context. In the first place, the private births that I witnessed were supported by rigorous psychological and physical preparation for birth from very early on in the pregnancy. There were long consultations, as is typical amongst independent midwives, to help women to develop a relationship of trust with both doula and midwife, and helping women overcome taboos about their excretionary holes, as the midwife I was working with told me. there was also a stress over and over again that it's a mother's responsibility to birth. We are at a point globally where our default idea is that you take your pregnant body over to someone else and then they get the baby out for you. So, part of that process was also working with moms to realize they're the ones who are going to do this. It was very important for everyone to be mindful of evidence-based research that's been accumulating over the last 30 years, to feel confidence in that physiological process. It was important for there to be virtual support, some kind of sense of a community through social networking or whatever that's positive, and then for there to be a birthing team. So the continuous care that was offered during labor and birth was sustainable because there were a few people involved in giving it, who had all been present for consultations and antenatal classes all the way through. There was some kind of a bounded space, which is an academic term meaning some kind of a safe space, like maybe a smallish room, maybe darkness, maybe it's quiet, maybe there's nice music, but something that makes a mom feel safe. And then maybe the most controversial thing is individualized treatment rather than standardized protocol care, and that can cause a lot of fear for birth workers because of the risks that they know are there in birth at any point. So maybe one of the most important things was also birth worker self-care, to work through fears and also to process each birth as it's happened. A doctor that I spoke to described her medical training and her obstetric experience during medical training, giving a very different picture of what I've just described. You jump into internship and you're called by a midwife with 20 years of experience when the shit hits the fan. This is the doctor speaking about something that happened to her like many years ago. She said, I remember very clearly being called for a shoulder dystocia, and I remember very clearly this purple turtle head sticking out, and the sisters were like, doctor, shoulder dystocia, and she's like, oh my God, this is it. And if you don't know the steps of the protocol, she said, then the child can be severely damaged from lack of oxygen or even die. But this is a very different situation to that private birth situation that I was describing, right? Because the doctor hadn't been there all along. She didn't know what kind of care the woman was having, or she wasn't in touch with that labor, with how that particular labor was progressing. She didn't know anything about the woman except what was on the medical chart because she'd never met her before. She was confronted with a situation that was already at a crisis point, and she had to act very quickly and so she relied on a standardized protocol. She had no experience at all of a peaceful birth. The emotional cost for her of attending births in this way was very high. She describes it this way. I'm going to read her words again. At the end of the night, you are absolutely smashed. I found myself crying, she says, asking myself, have I done the right things? Have I made the right decisions? And babies die sometimes, she says. Sometimes as a result of our mistakes, and sometimes because of late transfers or late referrals and slow transfer, and sometimes they just don't make it, and we just don't have a space for that. So this starts giving us a sense of why we should bother about this idea of private birth or of safe vaginal birth, right, when we do have so many other options at our disposal. And one of the biggest reasons, I think, is that we should care about the trauma that is being perpetrated both on women themselves and on doctors, because trauma itself is very expensive in many ways. It takes a long time to resolve, and it affects lots of people. It makes someone unable, or makes it difficult for people to love, to take part in community. It can shape somebody's childhood. So this is something that we want to avoid, quite apart from the very the relatively cheap health benefits of safe vaginal birth. So I wanted to start thinking about privilege a little differently, and then I'm going to come to human rights. I'm allowing myself a little bit more time because we are one speaker short. So, for all the mothers I spoke to, birthing was seen as a privilege, right? So in the broadest sense, all birth is privilege, because it's an astonishing privilege to give birth to another human being, no matter how it takes place. Right, and women, I think, are just so privileged in having this privilege. And the birth workers that I spoke to were also very conscious of this privilege of being there when a baby is being born, no matter what form that birth takes or their participation takes in it. And my fieldwork introduced me to the possibility that there were ways of thinking about birthing privilege that had less to do with material wealth and technological resources and more to do with privacy and control and with long-term health benefits individually and nationally. So I want to suggest that we move away from thinking about birth privilege in terms of whether it's in the private or the public sector. Certainly, private hospitals get better press than public ones, and they certainly do have more plush facilities and lower staff-to-patient ratios. They also have far higher C-section rates. Of all the births paid for with medical aids in South Africa in 2015, 67% were C-sections. And the anecdotal evidence that I have about why women are having C-sections in the private sector, it's almost, I've never come across someone who didn't have a medical reason, what they thought was a medical reason for it. So this is an astonishing figure because it suggests that there's a small group of South African women, the ones who can afford medical aid, who for some reason are physiologically incapable of giving birth vaginally, which just doesn't make sense, right? So there's this high C-section rate, and then there are political analysts who are saying that the private sector also needs to be better regulated because care can vary so much within even one practice. And we also know that people who are using medical insurance sometimes neglect basic health care because they don't get that covered, they just get hospital care, or because their daily savings, whatever, runs out before the end of the year, and so they stop going to the doctor for stuff, and I've certainly been in that position myself. So that leaves the country with a bit of a burden of health, which we already have quite a large burden of health. And then our private sector is more expensive in world terms than what it should be according to our GDP. So even though there's truly excellent care available and truly dedicated professionals, there are some problems which we don't often talk about. We more often talk about the public sector problems, which, are caused at least by the fact that the public sector has been underfunded for the last 50 years. And the panel last night told us something about the challenges that they're facing, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. But briefly, public sector C-section rates across all levels of facilities are somewhere around 23%, 30%, which is a lot closer to the World Health Organization recommendation of 10% nationally. But these rates are rising, and I would suggest that this could be, to a great extent, a part of the drive to reduce maternal mortality. Yet, as Jason said yesterday, the rates of preventable deaths related to C-sections in the public sector are rising. And that's the only cause of maternal death to be rising. These are not large numbers of deaths, but it's just of concern that they are rising and that they are preventable, unlike some of the other maternal deaths, which have more to do with HIV and is a more complicated problem in a way. So many people consider birthing privilege not only in the terms of the immediate outcome of the birth, but in terms of long-term health benefits for mother and child, and the impact of birthing process on future pregnancies and births. For the mothers in my study, they were concerned about the child's future immunity, and they were also concerned about increasing risk of adhesions, placenta accreta and percreta, and hemorrhage with each repeat C-section. So bearing in mind that a first C-section is usually grounds for a second C-section, even when this isn't entirely necessary. We can also think about birthing privilege in terms of human rights. Now, this information that I'm going to give you now is taken from the website of the Human Rights in Childbirth organization, which is an organization that's putting together the conference that's happening in India on human rights. And the first right I think is important is the right to informed consent. So when a doctor or healthcare provider recommends an intervention or treatment, they have a legal obligation to inform the patient of the risks and benefits of that full range of options available to the patient, not just the one that they're recommending. The patient is entitled to evidence-based, individualized recommendations, and the right to informed consent is also a right to evidence-based care, or for someone to tell you if what they want to recommend is something that's not supported by the evidence. The right to informed consent recognizes that 10 rational pregnant people with similar clinical charts might make 10 different decisions about what they want. One-size-fits-all protocol-dictated assembly line maternity care, the website says, violates the right to informed consent. But I also think that nobody's really thinking about that moment when the informed consent happens, which also might be when you're 8 centimeters dilated. And I don't know about you, but I was not in a good space at that point to be looking at forms and thinking about risk percentages. So that's something I don't know. Secondly, the human right to refuse medical treatment, which means that the patient is the legal authority in decisions about their care. It doesn't have to seem reasonable to the doctor or anybody else for a patient to refuse medical care. Or to refuse a recommendation, which means that nobody has to go to hospital legally, and it also means that you don't have to undergo an operation if you don't want to, if you think it's not a good idea. In the event of a disagreement about what to do at any given moment in birth, the person who holds the authority, the legal authority to make that decision, is the patient. And I think women aren't often informed about that. These two rights are both rooted in the right to privacy, which is in our Constitution, and which protects every person's ability to make personal decisions about sexuality, reproduction, and family without government interference. And I think that one should also think a little there about corporate interference, because a lot of us are making decisions based on what medical aids say they will pay for, or how malpractice insurance is playing out in a practice. And that kind of interference is going against a human right to make a free and fair decision. Birthing women so have a right to birth anywhere they want, because that's their privacy. And birthing women also have a reproductive right to choose physiological childbirth, but with meaningful healthcare support and emergency backup. Right. So lastly then, I think what I want you to take away from this slightly long talk is that home birth is not, that private birth is not necessarily home birth. In theory, private birth could take place in any number of venues, because it doesn't have to do specifically with the venue. Private birth takes a lot of preparation and skill, and it also changes how we think about birthing privilege. Thank you.